Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and today I'm joined by Sajjad Jihad, who's phoning in from Baghdad to talk about the new Iraqi government that started work on Thursday. Sajjad, welcome to Order from Ashes.
Thank you for having me again.
So, in the maelstrom of conflict and politics that are unfolding around the Iran war, people, certainly in the U.S., have lost sight, I think, of the big political changes underway in Iraq. But there was an election, and about 4 or 5 days before we recorded this podcast, so on Thursday the 14th, a new prime minister took office. So, can you tell us, start by telling us what's happened in the power transition in Iraq and why it's important?
Sure. So Iraq held national elections in November 2025. The uh, the outgoing prime minister did very well, but not well enough to cement his second term in office. And of course, as usual, we get coalition governments in Iraq because no party wins enough seats to form a government by itself. And despite the outgoing prime minister's best efforts to form a government, he wasn't able to do so. He had to essentially give up his post, and no other candidate was seen as favorable. Former Prime Minister Nourin Maliki was at one time touted as a possible replacement, but there was a tweet from Donald Trump, the American president, which said essentially that we would not work with a Maliki government. And so that sunk his hopes. Everybody else failed to get any serious support from the major parties. And that was the reason why there was essentially a deadlock for more than 5 months. And what happened essentially a couple of weeks ago was that the outgoing Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia Sudani, and the former Prime Minister, Noor Maliki, agreed on a compromise candidate, someone that they felt was close enough to them that they could have major influence over. And they pushed him. His name is Ali Zaidi. He's a businessman. They pushed him to become the next prime minister, and the other parties, particularly the Shia parties, agreed, and that's how he was able to form a government. Now, last Thursday there was a vote in Parliament. 14 cabinet positions were approved, and that's how Ali Zaidi became the new Iraqi prime minister. But there's still at least nine cabinet positions outstanding. So that will probably happen next month. But for the foreseeable future, we have a functioning Iraqi government, a new Iraqi government, and a new prime minister, somebody who is an unknown quantity. Most of the Iraqi public don't know who he is. Certainly, I think people following events in the US and Europe and elsewhere are also unsure of who this Ali Zaidi is. And I'd say the same applies to Iran as well. I don't think they have a good reading of this new prime minister. So some unknown quantities there. Some of the cabinet positions are still the same people, but I think this is a shift in terms of moving away from established politicians to somebody completely untested.
Yeah, so I think we're going to cover in turn a lot of the implications of this, and I want to start with the sort of bedrock question of who this leader is and how weak he is. I mean, just to remind our listeners, when we talk about Iraq, we're talking about a like very important geostrategic country with a huge number of men at arms, a huge amount of petrochemical resources, strategic borders, all connecting it to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan, Turkey. This is a military and economic powerhouse with a lot of strategic consequence. And in the 23 years since Saddam was toppled by a U.S. invasion, we've seen a political system take shape that has become, I think, weaker and weaker at being able to implement governing programs, right? And it seems like this new prime minister Ali Zaidi is the least political and the least powerful of all the sort of diminishing cast of figures who've been put into this critical job. So how do you read uh, Ali Zaidi's capability of forming a governing program or having power or being able to forget about defy his backers, just even make his own decisions about how to implement the plans his backers want him to implement?
So that's the difficult thing. There is no track record to assess because he is not a politician. He's never run for office. He is not a member of a party. He has no real political capital. So it is quite difficult to assess how independent he is going to be or how capable of a prime minister he will be because there is no, there's no experience to look at. He is a businessman. He's done fairly well in business. He has a few companies who have some large contracts with the Iraqi government. He's developing a bit of a business empire. He owns a university, for example. He owns some real estate. So he seems to be successful in that field, but there is no political experience to speak of. I'm not saying that's necessarily a disqualifying factor. I think, Donald Trump did not have extensive political experience when he
Well, and
took
he's done
office.
a terrible job at running the United States, so that's
Right, but he managed
an
to get top
indication.
office, yeah, and win twice. So I think Zaidi. Um, I think the public may give him the benefit of the doubt to start with, because they've grown tired of the existing faces in politics. So somebody new, somebody younger. He's not from a generation who is already 60 or 70 years of age. He's much younger than that. He's not. He was not in exile. He's born and bred here in Iraq. So I think that maybe gives him some time. But the question is, how will he manage to deal with the political parties? He has no MPs. He has no party that is his outright supporter. He has no real political capital by himself. He's completely dependent on the political parties. It's their ministers in cabinet, it's their MPs in parliament, it's their people in senior positions in government. And so that I think will be the test is can he somehow manage to get a functioning government to last for the next 4-year term and make some progress on vital issues like fighting corruption, like improving services, like trying to protect Iraq's sovereignty. We're not sure. We can't judge yet.
Well,
Like I say, I think the Iraqi public will give him some time, but probably next year, I think they will have made their mind up.
and when we refer to him as a businessman, to to clarify, it seems like his initial roots were in finance. He had a small financial holding company that eventually became the Islamic Bank, and then a holding company. And it's the kind of capital holding and financing empire that a lot of Iraqi corruption operates through, as I understand it in the Iraqi system. There's a sort of critical class of middlemen who do the financing and shareholding in complex nests of companies, and it's a way of, among other things, of helping large or rather powerful individual wealthy people and political factions of having pieces of either revenue streams or of companies without being directly tied to them. So, and I understand that that is one of the reasons why al-Zaidi was designated right by the U.S. Treasury, if I'm correct, as a for terror ties, which is an interesting piece of his resume, given that the U.S. did support his designation as prime minister, despite that record.
So I think it's typical of Iraq's, current system where politics and business mix. And for sure, anybody who builds up a business empire in Iraq will have had to grease the right hands, political or otherwise. And so Zaidi is very familiar with some of Iraq's top politicians, Nour al-Maliki, Hamid Shah Sudani, the head of the judiciary, Fagh Zaidan, and several others. He's on very good terms with people across the political spectrum, whether it's in the Kurdistan region, whether it's among Sunni politics. I think he's been able to develop those ties using some of the money that he has and benefiting from those ties. But in terms of sort of inside Iraq, there does not seem to be much known about him. There is no large scale scandal that surrounded some of the other businessmen in Iraq. He was not involved in the heist of the century. There seems to be no investigation of his companies in the Integrity Commission or otherwise. And the issue with the United States was against a bank that he was chair of, and it seems that was also eventually dismissed and went away. Zaidi himself is not indicted in anything. So in that sense, he has a clean record. But certainly he knows how to work the system. He would not have been able to build his business empire without it.
So, how should we understand the role of the prime minister? Is this a job that is the kind of executive assistant to the coordination framework, a person who implements the decisions made by the political party heads of the major Shia parties, I guess all the important Shia parties minus Muqtada Sadr, who meet under the banner of the coordination framework? Or should we understand the job in a more traditional sense as the political leader of Iraq, who not only represents a wide swath of Iraqis, but also has independent power to make decisions, whether about security or the economy or other crises, and act independently once they're in office.
I don't think the coordination framework of Shia parties would have approved a prime minister who was going to be independent of them. I think, they were even clear with the previous prime minister, Mohammed Shah Sudani, that he was a managing director of the executive. He works for the framework and manages the government on their behalf. I think the same will apply to this prime minister. He will not be independent of the parties, particularly the Shia parties, and he has no political capital. Mohammed Shah Sudani was an MP. He was previously a minister. He had his own small party. He was a governor in the past, so he had much more political capital. This new prime minister, I think, is completely dependent on the Shia parties, and that's the situation that they want. They like it that way. And I'm sure, when they proposed his name, I think they agreed on some key points with him, among which would have been to, go back to them when it came to the time to make key strategic decisions, and that he would not act independently. And in some senses, that might not be a bad thing. It may mean more cohesion between the parties and the prime minister. It means, he might have, an agenda that is more well suited to forming a coalition government and leading one. It may mean that, Parliament is going to be much more supportive of the prime minister rather than trying to trip him up by, investigating him or removing his ministers, as has happened in the past with some of the prime ministers. So it may not be a completely bad thing, but for sure, if we were looking at from a progressive lens, then this is not, a major change in Iraqi politics. It is more of the same.
I mean, it's possible. So, structurally speaking, before we even talk about political decisions or choices or programs that one might people might have different views about what they want Iraq to do. One of the structural things that your work has played a leading role in helping us understand is that the way that Iraqi governance and governing institutions have been structured since 2003, and sort of with each transition, this system has become more deeply enshrined, is around consensus and patronage sharing, and not around executive decision making or ability to govern. So again, independently of what a government is trying to implement, what we've seen is a deepening organizational, I mean, I would call it a pathology, but I think I should have a more neutral word, a sort of deepening organizational commitment to consensus and resource sharing between factions, and not towards the ability of a government to govern. And that adversely affects all kinds of matters like just economic development or economic reforms, or even very technical things like paving roads or getting the oil sector modernized. And to me, it seems like this move with Zaidi is a real. It's not a difference in kind, but it is a major change, because in the first phase, you had Iraq run by politicians, right? So people who had some kind of power base, some kind of credibility internally. They were all from the exile generation. It was a certain coterie of people. And that was the case all the way up until Sudani became prime minister, I guess 4 or 5 years ago now. So he was the first person who was an Iraqi who lived in Iraq during Saddam's time, didn't come in from abroad, was younger, and he was, I think, I don't know if this is credible, but at least he could make the case that he was both a technocrat and a person with some kind of political base inside Iraq. This new guy is neither. He's neither political nor technocrat, right? It's not as if he ran some important public sector institution. I mean, you could argue that some of the previous PMs like Kadhimi, he had never been elected to anything either, but he had run the National Intelligence Service. He had served in the public sector at a senior level, so he was part of the political establishment. This new prime minister is not part of the political establishment, not part of the administrative establishment. He is not a technocrat, and he's not a politician. He's none of the above. And I think that is I don't know what I think that means long run for the Iraqi system, but I think that is a significant departure. And one of the things, and this is I'm going to end with this as a question: uh, does it position Iraq to be unable to respond quickly to crises if the both the president and now the prime minister are essentially sort of chiefs of staff to other centers of political power? How will the state, how will the government be able to respond in real time to crises like the almost weekly crises that are unfolding as a result of the Israeli American war on Iran?
So, I mean, obviously, the flip side of that is if you have a prime minister who is at loggerheads with the parties, then you'll get a more dysfunctional government and even less likely to be able to respond quickly and positively to any crisis. So, from that perspective, I'm looking at the glass half full. At least we have a prime minister who, for now, seems to get on very well with the political parties, especially the Shia parties. But he's also, his designation has been welcomed by the Sunni parties and the Kurdish parties, and obviously Iran and the United States. So, if we look at it from a very optimistic point of view, then there should be no obstacle to the prime minister running a perfectly functioning government and one that has significant backing in parliament. The cynical point of view is that, the point that you were mentioning, which is part of a project that we're actually working on at Century. We're looking at how the state of Iraq has developed over recent years. And one of the arguments I make in one of the papers there is that as the party system as the political parties have become more entrenched in the political system, the effectiveness of governance has gone down. So while the parties have got stronger, the quality of governance has gone down. And I think that this will still hold with this new prime minister. He may have some political stability, he may have a more cohesive government, but if the trend continues, then that will see the parties become stronger without actually improving the general situation for Iraq citizens too much. And that is the concern that even if we have stability on the surface, that actually Iraq is not dealing with the long-term issues, some of which have become crises, like electricity, like climate, like education, like security, which is still a problem. These issues may not feature every single day in the news, but they are still a problem 23 years after regime change. So you can look at it, like I say, glass half full or half empty. But for now, I think the prime minister, from the public's perspective, is being given the benefit of the doubt. They are very tired of the old faces. They are tired of the old generation. Zaidi looks to be a successful young businessman, and to the average Iraqi, that's probably better than having somebody who's already been in office and somebody who's well known to them, somebody who's a member of one of the parties. I think they want a fresh face, so maybe that will work in his favor.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to Order from Ashes. We're talking to Sajad Jihad, who's on the phone or on the Zoom from Iraq, talking about the new Iraqi government that came into being a couple of days ago on May 14th. Sajad, one more sort of logistical question about the government, and then I want to switch to some of the policy issues that it's facing immediately. Uh, what are the highlights of the ministers selected, and have the sovereign ministries been selected, or is that still under debate?
So there was 14 cabinet positions that have been approved, but the outstanding ones among them are the defense, which is a key position, interior, which is also a key position. Um, there are also some squabbles over who will be nominee for the Ministry of Higher Education and a few others. But what's interesting is some of the cabinet positions have already been filled by people who have been ministers in previous governments or some well-known MPs. And I think the shape of the cabinet was probably more decided by the parties than the prime minister. I think they presented him with a list of candidates for each ministry, and essentially he had to pick from within those candidates of who he would like to see in that post, and then the parties voted that person in Parliament. The fact that not all of them were confirmed just tells you that the parties were struggling to agree in terms of positions, who gets which position, and then who exactly they wanted to be as their candidate. And there's also been, I think, a bit of a split within the coordination framework. The State of Law, which is Maliki's political alliance, did not manage to get its candidates for ministry positions through, and that has upset them because the other parties did not want to vote for their candidates. And it may mean that the State of Law decides to form a separate alliance within the framework or outside of the framework. And I think that could be significant. The Kurdish parties were also, competitive against each other in terms of, the positions that they nominated and who they voted for, and likewise among the Sunni parties as well. So it's still very fragmented, despite the fact that they managed to push through a government after several months of deadlock.
So no big takeaways yet in terms of like who's going to be in charge of finance or security and indicate like no indications yet of whether we're going to be seeing business as usual in some of the corrupt practices or whether we might see some departures, whether again in security or the economy towards better or different approaches. Is it too soon for you to make any kind of prognostications on those fronts?
Yeah, probably too soon, but also I think, the fact that Iraq hasn't been able to export oil for 2+ months, it just means there's no money at the moment. There is no budget in place. Iraq's revenues have dwindled to almost nothing. It's been drawing down on the foreign reserves quite a bit. So I think there's a massive financial crisis brewing. And even if the party still wanted to engage in or approve of corrupt practices, right now they're not able to extract much resources because Iraq is not making any money.
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting presentation at the Iraq conference in Washington last week. Ziad Daoud from Bloomberg, who's I think one of the better analysts of the Iraqi economy, he had a sort of rundown of Iraq's current accounts, and taking into account the disappearance of oil revenue, and he had some sort of back of the envelope calculations based on what's in the reserves. And if I remember correctly, he seemed to predict that by July, Iraq would be unable to pay public sector salaries, and that would, of course, be a huge crisis, since one of the government's main surviving functions is to support the plurality of the population that lives off of these inflated public sector salaries that are entirely dependent on oil revenue. So if that analysis is correct, this new government is going to it's already facing from day one a security crisis, which we'll talk about in a minute, and maybe in short order it will face a nearly existential economic crisis.
That's right. I think the government's already been struggling to pay some salaries, and has obviously fallen behind in terms of payments to contractors and to debts that are owed. And I think the new government is going to face a liquidity crisis. We have money outside the country getting it into Iraq quick enough to be able to then convert that into dinars and pay people is a bit of an issue. Drawing down money from state-owned banks has been the go-to answer in the past, but those banks have also essentially run out of cash. So I think your Ziad's calculations are absolutely right. Even if we have enough currency reserves, we don't actually have enough cash in hand to be able to pay people on time if we don't manage to sell oil in the next month or so. Yeah.
So what if any options will a new government have in the face of that kind of crisis?
I mean, taking on more debt is really the only solution, and that might mean withdrawing more money from the state-owned banks, issuing some bonds,
Who's
turning to
willing to
credit market.
loan money to the Iraqi government?
Yeah, I mean, the expectation is that Iraq will be able to sell oil eventually, so that it's not, the revenue hasn't completely stopped. I think the expectation is that as soon as there is some sort of deal with Iran, and that Iraq will go back to being a major exporter. But Iraq still has 90 plus $billion abroad, so there's a possibility to lend against some of those reserves because they're protected in the United States, and so Iraq is not going to default on any of that debt. There are some options out there, but I think the government is coming in a very difficult time, and the financial crisis is just one of the major issues facing it.
Well, so let's talk about the security crisis. I mean, there's a lot of aspects that we could get into, but I want to focus on, well, one, I was going to say two, one and a half. The pressure to on the Iraqi government, specifically from the United States, to do something about the four militia groups that are perceived to be operating under Iranian control and autonomously from Iraqi government control. This has been a major push from the U.S. government. It seems that they've been privately and sometimes publicly willing to use more pressure than in the past, including economic levers, to try and force the Iraqi government to do something about this. And I think me and you share an understanding that not only is the Iraqi government not really interested in doing something about this, but even if they were, that they could not, that they do not have the power or tools at their disposal to take control of these groups. But I guess the question for you is, what's your sort of diagnosis of the problem here, and what options does the government have to try and thread the needle on this issue?
There's obviously considerable pressure from the United States to make sure the groups that it's designated are not finding their way into cabinet or into senior government positions. But I think also that the US has been pragmatic in the past and will continue to be so. It understands that Iraq is not going to change overnight. It understands that any government that comes in is going to be a coalition government. It's not going to have a huge amount of political capital or mandate, and that the nature of Iraqi politics means that some of the groups that the US has an issue with are embedded into the structure of the society itself, into the security forces, into the bedrock of the state itself. And so expecting to be able to pull that out by its roots, it's unlikely to happen quickly. And I think that's probably why why the United States has welcomed the formation of this new Iraqi government, because it expects that at least for now, the cabinet positions are not going to be given to members of parties that the United States has designated. And I think that's what's happened. The 14 cabinet positions so far that have been approved have not gone to anyone who belongs to a party that the US has major issues with. So I think in some respects, that's a step forward from the US perspective. From a domestic perspective, I think the fact that some of these parties did well in the elections means that you cannot freeze them out. They are willing to play politics. They're willing to be engaged. The issue is really more with the military side. Will they continue to launch drones and rockets from inside Iraqi territory, targeting other countries? Will they continue to get involved in any conflict between the US and Iran, despite the commander-in-chief's wishes? Will they continue to target facilities and so on inside Iraq, whether it's American facilities, whether it's American-linked businesses or so on, even diplomatic institutions? I think that's really the concern: is can these groups rein in those actions? Can the government pressure them to stop undermining essentially sovereignty? And if they do manage to do that, if they do reduce their uh, military or irregular activities, let's call them, then I think they will find themselves more welcomed politically, even potentially from the US itself. And so I think it's baby steps maybe at this point in time,
Yeah, I
particularly
mean
given
the
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 what's the
my
conflict.
my my read of situation of the sort of politics from the U.S. side is that maybe they're no longer willing to accept that formula, right? I mean, I think the formula you describe has pertained over quite a long period of time, over at least since the middle of the counter ISIS campaign. So like going back 10 years, uh, the U.S. and others, the Gulf as well, have been willing to accept a certain amount of activity from some of these, let's say, renegade or some of these militias that operate outside the umbrella of the Iraqi state, and have sort of been willing to take on good faith that the Iraqi government is doing all it can, and that the Iraqi government shares the frustrations of others when these militias, let's say, attack an embassy, or as they have done during this recent war, have launched a huge share of the attacks into Saudi Arabia, right? So this isn't just about, are these groups attacking American military facilities? These groups are attacking a key strategic ally in the Gulf that the Iraqi government wants to keep on side, and the Iraqi government is not happy to have an Iraq-based militia that is effectively part of the governing coalition attacking Saudi Arabia, and I assume the Iraqi government also doesn't like that these militias have destroyed a whole bunch of Iraqi military or intelligence radars inside Iraq, which as I understand it, were destroyed because the militias thought these installations were somehow being used by the Americans or by the Israelis to spy on the militias, but in fact, these radars were being used by the Iraqi government to engage in sovereignty enhancing security work. So I assume that is frustrating to Baghdad, to sort of be sniped or undermined from one of their own coalition partners. That said, from the outside, I don't see that the Iraqi government has any tools other than asking nicely, like beyond asking nicely, what can the Iraqi government do vis-a-vis Kataib, Hezbollah, and its Nujaba and its smaller subsidiaries to persuade or compel them to defer to Iraqi government sovereignty.
So, absent a deal between the United States and Iran, I don't think that Iraq can make serious progress on that front. I think it's completely dependent on having some sort of peace in the region. Um, these groups, believe that they have a right to hold weapons and to use their weapons in defense of a common cause with Iran. And they will also point to the fact that Iraqi sovereignty is undermined by Israel and the US. The recent example of Israel operating secret bases in the Iraqi desert for over a year, which were then used to carry out operations inside of Iran, and that the US helped cover that up. So these groups believe their actions are justified. If there is a lasting peace between Iran and the US, then these groups will have less of a justification to do what they're doing. In fact, Iran will not want them to be disruptive, and therefore less likely for them to be active in terms of undermining Iraqi sovereignty. But if there is no deal, if there is more conflict, I think these groups will, justify their actions. They have some support from the Iraqi public, and they will say, well, we cannot lay down our weapons because the US and Israel are intending to wipe out Iran's state or government, and they're also targeting the Shia specifically, whether it's in Iran or in Lebanon or Yemen. And therefore, Iraqi Shia groups should not be laying down their weapons. So it really depends, I think, on what happens between Iran and the US.
Yeah, and I mean the most likely scenario is one that's not a full solid deal, right? Something between a peace agreement and full war, where there'll be, as I understand it, some number of political understandings, some amount of recurring flare-ups. A state that I would describe as low-intensity war. I think that's the most likely outcome between Iran and the United States. Something that allows most oil commerce to resume, if not all. but not something that allows the resumption of like a fully predictable and stable security order, which I think is going to be deleterious for all the countries, uh, especially those like Iraq that about the Persian Gulf. And I think it's also going to be very deleterious for the project of creating a consistent order around the governance of militias, right? Because the real, I think the American question about the militias it's a notional and somewhat silly question, right? So the American question is, who and when, who will disarm these militias and when will it happen? And I think those of us who study this context understand that that is not on the table, right? What's on the table is choices along a spectrum of more or less state authority over these groups, on a sort of sliding scale. And if we accept that that's the spectrum we're working on, the U.S. approach right now, which is I think lends itself towards maximum instability, is going to translate into maximum instability on the question of a sort of monopoly of arms. Like the Iraqi government is not going to be able to tell Qatar what to do in a scenario where every month or every quarter it's possible that the US is going to attack Iran again. In that unstable scenario, of course, the armed groups are going to remain on high alert and protect their maximal autonomy.
That's right. I think you've got that described pretty well. If there is no uh, understanding, as you said, between Iran and the US, then I don't think we can believe it to be realistic that these groups will um, reduce their activity, let's say. I think one of the key tests is, can Iraq not be a source of instability? Can Iraq not threaten neighboring countries? Can Iraq not threaten US interests? I think that's probably the key test, just whether there is a deal with Iran or not with the US. And I think that metric is a good one. I think the Gulf countries are very concerned that even if there's no threat to American interests, there is, capabilities being projected by these groups to disrupt oil exports, energy, in, for example, Saudi or the UAE, and they believe that the Iraqi government is failing to stop these. And so, if the Iraqi government can ensure these incidents do not happen, I think that might be a first test for the Zaidi government. And second is if there is some sort of understanding with Iran and the US that these groups are much less active, have a much lower profile, I think that would also be reassuring.
So how do people in Iraq look at these Israeli bases? Do they believe the government helped, that the Iraqi government helped cover up, like that members of the government knew about these bases and helped the Americans cover them up? And if so, do people view that as treasonous?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of accusation flying around, those who are critical of the previous government, and those who are backing the pro-Iran groups will say that, there is clear evidence that the Israelis were operating inside the country. The Americans helped cover that up, and most certainly officials in the Iraqi security establishment were aware and decided to work with the Americans on that. There is an investigation, I think, in Parliament by one of the MPs that's begun. There's government has announced its own investigation, but we'll see how credible that is. The public is shocked the fact that it wasn't just something that was operating during the war. It's something that goes back well before the war, more than a year before the war, and the fact that even after it came to light that there was a base in the Iraqi desert and an Iraqi shepherd was killed. He was the one who discovered the base, or at least called it out publicly. The fact is that for 2 months there seemed to be no movement on the issue, and since seemed to be a cover up by the Iraqi security forces themselves. And it was only because the news broke out in American media that the Iraqi government had to acknowledge that the whole existence of these bases and now has begun an investigation.
So because the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Times had these stories, that's why it's a political issue. Had
That's
those
right.
stories not occurred, it would have just been swept under the carpet.
That's right. That was probably what the Iraqi government was attempting to do. That's right.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting and in many ways damning spotlight on the erosion of sovereignty inside Iraq, right? And this dates back to the U.S. invasion, and I think a lot of really like distasteful compromises that the Iraqi government simply had to make from a point of weakness over various points over the last 20 years. When the Iraqis are dependent on outside help, whether from Iran or the United States, to turn back ISIS, like many chapters like this have led to this creepy power imbalance where a whole suite of groups, including Iran and the US, but also including some of the Iraqi factions and others, have carved out literal chunks of Iraqi territory where the government isn't allowed to set foot, where certainly Iraqi civilians aren't allowed to set foot, where there's no oversight. And I guess, one assumes I assume that someone in the Iraqi government and someone in the U.S. and Iranian and other establishments has visibility over all these things. But given how many carve outs there are that are known, right? Where for example, Kataib Hezbollah has control over a whole chunk of territory south of Baghdad and Jurf al-Sakhar, and that's just sort of a known a known a black hole in Iraqi sovereignty. There's areas in Kurdistan where it's been reputed that not only the Americans but also the Israelis have had freedom of operation over the last several decades. So these are sort of if not facts, these are sort of widely shared assumptions that I think over time have contributed to a real collapse of assumptions about sovereignty. Right? We would assume in a healthy sovereign state that the government would just get to decide which, if any, foreign troops or domestic militias get to operate on the territory, and that's never fully been the case since 2003. These Israeli bases cross, even in this context I'm describing, these Israeli bases go so much further, right? These are like these I think must be shocking to any Iraqi nationalist or just security analyst who thinks, good God, we should at a minimum be able to decline to have a hostile power that's at war with our neighbor and close ally operating on our territory. And I wonder what conversations, if any, this has propelled about this core question of sovereignty.
Unfortunately, this is the situation since 2003. I think there was a conscious decision by the US to make sure that Iraq was never going to be able to say no to the US, and degradation of Iraq's capabilities in terms of protecting its airspace was one of those. I think other countries, the Turkish military has been operating in Iraq for decades, and runs bases inside Iraq against the wishes of the Iraqi government. Iran launches, missiles frequently into Iraq again against the wishes of the Iraqi government. And unfortunately, the complicity of these states in making sure that Iraq is not completely sovereign, I think, is just an unwritten agreement among them all that we should be able to play in Iraq as our playground for conflicts. I think that's really the unwritten agreement. And the Iraqi government has never been able to fully protect its sovereignty. And I don't see it being able to do so in the near future, maybe a longer term course. And it's a source of frustration for, analysts, of course, who believe that if Iraq was able to, protect its sovereignty, then it would, be much stronger. It would be able to prevent conflict even in the region as well. And it would certainly, be able to control its own security much better. But because of the fact that these other states want to be able to do what they're doing, and post 2003 Iraq was shaped in this way, I think it's made Iraq weaker. And unfortunately, there's arguments on most sides over who has the right to do what. And Iraqi government is the one that's silent. And unfortunately, it's a situation that makes the average Iraqi citizen very angry, particularly when there is an attack from one of these countries or there is an incident and so on, where the Iraqi government is just a bystander. And I think it's a source of deep frustration for Iraq's politicians as well.
So is there no going back to the high water mark of at least centralization of control? I mean, I think back to before the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes in January 2020. And while those two men were still alive, uh, they were able to regulate the activities of these militias, right? So if they asked the militias to hold back, the militias would hold back. They couldn't 100% control them, but it seemed like they could 90+% control their actions. Um, in the aftermath, in the 6 years since then, it seems that no one, not within the militia architecture, not within the Hashid, not within Iraq or Iranian leadership, has that kind of influence. And I wonder if you think we're sort of conclusively for the long term in a realm where whatever happens, fragmentation will be like a fundamental ingredient of the landscape, and no single actor or even like pair of powerful figures will be able to steer the course of events.
I mean, I don't want to get into hypotheticals about what if and, attempt some revisionism or anything of that type, but certainly, I think the loss of Soleimani Mohandes meant that there was less influence and control over pro-Iran groups in Iraq. Absolutely. From an American perspective, that's seen as a good thing. Obviously, I would challenge that notion. Right now, I think there is a window of opportunity that was opening up. Unfortunately, may have been closed because of the conflict with Iran, but may open up again in the future, where these groups realize that, if they want to continue to have or enjoy some power, then they need to transition fully to politics, and they need to be less, active in terms of their renegade activities. And like I say, Iran will probably push them towards that avenue as well, if they believe that they have a long-term understanding with the United States. Um, on the Iraqi side, yes, we have a evident lack of people who have influence. Forget control. We're talking just about influence over these groups. The Iranians themselves don't have the same relationships with these groups as they did in the past. Obviously, they still, have tremendous influence, and um, certainly, I think within the IRGC, there are people who have direct relationships with these groups. But Iran is also busy with its own security, and so maybe it has a little bit less time in terms of trying to manage these groups. And there's a lot of domestic pressure as well, in addition, obviously, to the international pressure for these groups to not be so visible. So yes, we've lost some influence domestically from the Iraqi perspective, but there's also a relative situation that Iraq needs to be more normal, more stable, and I think even these groups understand that. So I think really the issue is just completely dependent on Iran and the US at this moment in time.
So let's end this conversation with a little look at the immediate future for this new government. What are the uh, landmark events or things that are already on the calendar that are going to be the first either tests or indications of how the Zaidi government is going to try to rise to the challenge of creating a more functional Iraq?
So I think, yeah, what we mentioned earlier about being able to pay salaries. So, can the government find a way out of this financial crisis? What if, the all exports continue to be frozen for several months? What will they do then? When can the Zaidi government pass a budget? Uh, these are the things that need to happen this summer, in terms of, getting us out of the hole that we're in. Um, by the end of the year, you'd expect some major positions to have been filled or changed. Um, we've got, the traditional issues that we have over the summer in terms of service delivery, electricity, and so on. So what will the government do to manage these, evergreen crises. And then as
The
we get into
annual riots in Basra when there's no electricity to power the air
right,
conditioning.
right, and luckily we've had quite a bit of rain in the winter, so water supplies are hopefully going to be good through the summer. But what if we get another dry winter? What happens then? If we manage to get into next year and we have a water shortage. So, these are tests, visible tests, I think that we will be able to assess the Zaidi government's performance on. But I think probably the most immediate thing is really just being able to pay the civil servants. There were millions of people on the public sector payroll, and I think that will be the litmus test for how capable this government is.
Is there a decision point to be made with the sort of American stranglehold over Iraqi oil revenue? I mean, it's always struck me as bizarre that and I guess this is relatively normal in oil markets, but it struck me as bizarre that Iraq's oil revenue comes to an account at the New York Fed, and the U.S. government basically can decide if it wants to limit Iraq's access to its own money, um, and maybe that's just a thing that can't be changed. But I'm wondering if there is a decision point uh, in the near future where Iraq can begin to implement the sort of the technical capability to not depend on U.S. largesse for access to Iraq's own financial resources.
I don't see anything of that sort in the short term. I think, maybe a plan in the longer term to try to diversify away from concentrating Iraq's revenues in the United States. But for now, I think, Iraq wants to maintain a very good relationship with the US. Um, the US has welcomed a new prime minister and new government. And so I think for now, I don't see any change in the way Iraq's revenues are managed with the US.
So and on climate, water, and other livelihood concerns, there aren't any sort of immediate jumping off a cliff points that to your knowledge are going to face this new government over the coming year.
I mean, look, unfortunately, Iraq has is ripe ground for crises, and yet at the same time somehow seems to muddle through. So despite the fact that there's a new government and there's an experienced prime minister, we may yet survive into next year without no worse off than we are today. Or one of these crises could develop into something that the new government will not be able to control. You really can't tell. And unfortunately, Iraq is just plagued by poor governance that I don't think any single government can dramatically improve. But you know, um, at the same time, there is a lot of resources available in Iraq. I think there is an international interest in trying to make Iraq stable. And as I said, if there is a understanding, if there is a deal between the United States and Iran, I think that will reflect very well for Iraq.
Is I know I said that was going to be my last question, but now I have one more last question. Is Iraq in any different or better position administratively after 4 years of Sudanese rule than it was before? Because a big part of his program, at least rhetorically, was to not just create a web of development projects that would meaningfully improve the quality of life for regular Iraqis, but also to really do uh, the critical drudgerous work of fixing government institutions so that government can actually get things done. So did any of that actually happen, or was that more rhetorical than concrete?
No, I think there were some positives from the Sudani government. I think his effort to improve infrastructure was visible, it was felt by the average Iraqian, and it was something that the Prime Minister personally invested a lot of effort in and political capital in. The flip side to that is, a lot of it was done because of the power of his interventions and his office, and has not really helped develop the institutions responsible for making those developments. So the Zaidi government comes in, and maybe it requires Zaidi to do what Sudani did, which is to roll up his sleeves and personally get involved in trying to push Iraq ahead. Or, that politicians realize that this is not the best way, and the better way is to develop institutions so they can continue to function well, regardless of who is prime minister. But we have a coalition government. Each party controls a ministry and so on, or has influence over a ministry or a particular body within a ministry. And therefore, it makes it much more difficult to expect a prime minister to just allow, the ministries to function without a push from his office. And so I think Zaidi will learn a lesson from Sudanese government that if he wants the public to be happy, he will need to personally get involved in trying to push things ahead. And maybe that's what Iraqi bureaucracy needs. It may need a prime minister to continuously try to push things forward. Um, Obviously, from a political perspective, the parties will want to maintain what they have. They do not want a prime minister trying to, absorb some of their roles and functions, and they want to maintain their own ability to extract resources. So they probably do not want the prime minister to become too involved. But the Iraqi public would like to see something more along the lines of what Soudani was doing, which was getting involved personally to try to push things forward.
Yeah, I mean, every indication from what I'm hearing from you today and what I've been hearing from others is that we should have very low expectations. In sort of most of the problematic ways, we should expect more of the same, and a kind of deepening of this system, this sort of sharing of the spoils system. And I guess the most positive thing we've seen here is that the transition to the new government occurred without violence between the factions. So, unlike the last time around, the powerful Shia factions did not have to come to literal gunfire with each other in order to negotiate their shares in the new government. So that's a positive. And the negative is that the system works for itself, but not for Iraqi well-being. Right, the system has gotten better and better at perpetuating its own internal arrangements, which are mainly about keeping these factions in power and with access to resources that they can raid for their own benefit. And less and less is less and less evident is the goal of delivering better governance, economic prosperity, and security to Iraqi people.
That's right. Low expectations, and the jury's out on Zaidi. Check back in 12 months.
Well, and we'll be checking back with you on that question, maybe sooner than 12 months, and if not, definitely in 12 months. Sajjad Jihad, thank you so much for joining us on Order from Ashes.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. We'll be back again next week with another episode of Order from Ashes. Take care. See you then.